All right. So this is the Art Postgraduate Talk Series. The talk series is organized by... Oh, please. Do you want me to point a laser at you to shut you up? Okay. So the series is organized by the program leaders for the postgraduate program. So Anna Collin for curating, Edgar Schmitz for the PhD, Elle Reynolds for graduate diploma, Gail Pickering, Artist for the Moving Image. Roz, you're exactly where you need to be. I'm Rahel Malik, so that's me. And I teach on the MFA Fine Art. The information about the VLE, about the Art Postgraduate Talks is on the VLE. This is the QR code, so if you want more information about the talks coming up and so on and so forth, use this. I've tested it, it should work. So for the introduction today, there's quite a lot we need to do before I introduce Gary Zhexi Zhang, who's the speaker. I'm going to tell you what the postgraduate talks are in relation to the rest of your programs. And I'm going to do, Roz and I are going to do a broad introduction on the theme of planetarities in the plural. Okay, I'll do the first bit quite quickly. So what we're trying to do with the postgraduate talk is provide a general context for what the program leaders, there's our sense of what matters for artists and people in the art field working today. Most of the teaching of the department is what we call student-centered, which is that you come in with your practices, your specific interest. We support that on a case-by-case, one-to-one basis. There aren't many opportunities where we come in with what we think is important, a kind of framework for artistic practice, and that framework can come from many different things, either changes in the art field or issues which are kind of broader concern like the planetary and the move from the global to the planetary. Okay, so the postgraduate talks are just to give an overview of a large context which may not be immediately of consequence to you for your practice, but we think is a way to think about changes in the art space and the ways that we talk about things. Okay, because our concepts and the ideas and the critiques that we work with aren't historically stable. They change according to how the world is changing. So what we're trying to address in the postgraduate talks is a common situation for everyone, but especially people working in the art field. As I said earlier, for example, a critical framework that we just assume and trying to understand whether that's still the right place to be. The currency of the issues that we're dealing with, and maybe that'll become more apparent when we start talking about the planetary contrasted to the global. We try and introduce some challenges to conventional critical frameworks. We'll see how successful that is. I think today's talk will probably be quite challenging for most of us in a good way. What we're not doing is providing you with a course that you then have to go and do some study for or do some pre-reading for. Okay, so there's no syllabus associated with this, and there's no required reading. Okay, so it's a kind of input or a kind of propulsion, a demand that's put upon you to kind of think about what you're doing in relation to a context that might be a little bit far away for some of you, a lot closer for others, but we think kind of informs the general space that we're working in as people interested in art making now. So this series of talks for the first term is Planetarities in the Plural. We'll explain in a bit why that title. These are the speakers. I don't think we should introduce it now. I think just move into, all right. But these are the dates. So the next talk is in 2 weeks. There's a midterm break, a reading week in between the second and third talks. And then there's 2 weeks between Planetary Portals and Lukasz Lekavchan, who's doing the last talk this term. All right. So there's only 4 talks. Each of these speakers is coming from a different angle, but all of them are trying to understand this emerging notion of the planetary. And what we're trying to do is just give you like a matrix or a scheme to understand this term. And as I said earlier, you can then think about whether this term matters for you or whether it changes anything about thinking of the whole, essentially. All right, so the format of the talks is a standard 34-minute presentation, then a discussion here at the table with the host. In this case today, it'll be me. Roz will be doing the second and third talks. I'll be doing the fourth talk. And then there'll be Q&A for about half an hour with you guys. Okay? And that discussion, 10, 15 minutes, is just to go over like main issues in the talk and also give you time to think about any questions you might want to formulate. I should also mention there's a bar after the talks, which is, does anybody here anybody from MFA Fine Art? Do you want to mention the bar, or should I do it? So basically, the end of year exhibition for the MFA Fine Art is self-funded by the students. The after bar is something that they've organized as a bit of fundraising. It's not just alcoholic drinks, it's also non-alcoholic drinks. It's the one point in the term, or in the week, where all the students from all the different programs meet. Okay, we don't usually see each other because the programs are quite siloed. So it's quite a good place just to kind of get to know each other and find out what the other program is about and like what's going on across the department postgraduate provision. All right, so planetarities in the plural. So we're now a quarter of the way through the 21st century. We're now closer by 3.5 months to 2050 than we are to the year 2000. So we're heading towards Q2, the second quarter of the 20th century. We're now in it. And what we know is a bit of a shit show, right? So the major issues that are facing us compared to the recent history are climate breakdown, obviously, and deglobalization. And deglobalization is a way to talk about the breakdown of the globalization project, which was put in place from like the 90s, early 90s onwards. And it seems pretty clear that the resurgence of state nationalism and racist nationalism around the world are ways of people responding to deglobalization and the costs of globalization on states and on nations. But this climate breakdown and deglobalization aren't a prospect or an impending future or a threat. They're our here and now. Okay, this is the world that we occupy right now. So we seem to be back in some kind of history after what Francis Fukuyama in the early 90s called the end of history. And the end of history was a way for Fukuyama to think about. I'll put the reference up in a minute. The end of history was a way for Fukuyama to identify the domination of the West and of liberal democracies after the collapse of Soviet communism in the late 80s. It was also a way to signify supposed post-colonial alignment with liberal democratic conventions, which was often coerced by World Bank and IMF through debt restructuring, getting those countries to align with Western-led globalization, global trade. And it was also a way to think a bit later about that alignment with liberal democratic conventions or with Western global trade imperatives was reinforced by US-led crushing of East Asian economies in the mid to late 90s. Okay? So the end of history is really a way to think about globalization as the world-dominant narrative and also the world-dominant arrangement between different regions and different countries and so on. But this end, we know, was a narrative of Western historical supremacy. It's a kind of follow-through to Western modernity into a postmodern, commercially interchangeable globe. And in this, it signaled a phase shift from Western modernity to globalization, a shift accompanied by changes in what you might call historical operating systems. So this table kind of summarizes that point, which is basically from about 1650, like early 1700s, Western modernity, for the West, Western modernity was the way things worked. The whole that Western modernity referred to was the world. The scale it operated at was a nation state, the nation or the state, which is like a mesoscale, like a mid-level, medium-scale operation. The agent of that modernity was the subject, and the art of that modernity came to be known as modernism. Okay? So that's kind of what a lot of art history is concerned with. Postmodernity, the whole is not the world, but the globe. Okay, globalization. The scale it operated at, the scale it operated at was more the individual or the firm, which is a microscale. The agent was not the subject, but the consumer, the entrepreneur. And the art of this postmodernity was contemporary art, which is predominantly what we do here. Okay. But in this era of globalization, Gayatri Spivak in 2003, so about 10, 15 years into the globalization era, proposed a counter-ethics of planetarity, which for her meant a way of relating to difference at scales commensurate with globalization, so this kind of whole, right? But it wasn't the commercial whole, or the whole organized through the consumer, the entrepreneur, but a way of thinking about the alterities involved when we encounter each other at the scale of the whole globe. I'm going to hand over to Roz, who will speak a bit more about this alternative image of the planetary.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things we were thinking about with planetarities in the plural is that we have an intersecting interest in this and we think it's broadly important, but we also come from very different positions. And I think one of the ways in which I'm interested in planetarity is that it involves relations to land in the broadest sense as that which enables the habitability of the planet. And that which sustains us, that which perhaps we have an elemental kinship with. And so Spivak evokes the land to suggest a kind of planetary belonging, suggesting we belong to land or to the planet rather than certain humans or communities or economies owning or territorializing land, and that this creates a different kind of accountability. So underpinning Spivak's argument is this interest in how knowledge is situated, and that's something we talk a lot about, is how knowledge is embodied and is kind of contingent to particular spaces and times. And also how theoretical concepts and discourses emerge from practices. And that's, I think, something that I hope will emerge in the talks that we're going to have in the following weeks. So they're practices that are embedded, political, and like non-transferable to a certain extent. You know, they're not like the sort of flow of commodities through globalization. Another theme that I think would be great to kind of start to grapple with in these coming weeks is, in a way, the radical interdisciplinarity of art as a space holder for different kinds of practice and communities in dialogue, collaboration, and tension with one another. So this is not the smooth space of globalization where everything's interchangeable, rather it's a space of incommensurabilities, of scale, of ideas, of situativeness, and so on.
Great. So I think do you have more, or is that? No. Okay. So I think in addition to the other ways of belonging to land, rather than ownership or commerce, what we're noticing with climate breakdown is the vulnerabilities. We saw this a lot through the COVID period, right? The vulnerabilities that climate breakdown introduces in supply chains that are the material conditions of globalization. So my interest isn't so much around the relation to land, but about how the supply chains that we rely on through globalization, which were constructed in these very long supply chains, which was known as globalization, kind of become extremely susceptible to things like changing weather conditions, fires, other kind of hazards from climate. And this has led to planetarity also signifying, in addition to what Roz has just pointed out, a kind of material interconnectedness of climate, economic, and environmental systems, which we'll also cover in the presentations. So I mean, this is all kind of fairly large scale. There's a recent book by Jonathan Blake and Niels Gilman called Children of a Modest Star, and they've got this quite useful summary about the move from globe and globalization to the planetary. So they say, this is quite a long quote, so please bear with us. The global of globalization, as historian Dipesh Chakrabarty has pointed out in a book called The Climate in the Planetary Age, I think, so this globe of globalization is not the same as the global of global climate change. Okay, so there's at least two types of globe you need to think about. The global of globalization is a conceptual category which Roz has just mentioned is like the smooth space of trade and economics and the rest of it, that frames the Earth in human terms. Hence, globalization's human-centric understanding of the worldwide integration of the last few decades, the accelerating flow of people, their goods, their ideas, their money, their data, us, basically. Like contemporary art is very much of this space, okay? The vision of the globe, this vision of the globe makes plain that Earth is not humanity's, oh, sorry, I've kind of jumped a bit. The globe of global climate change, by contrast, frames Earth without specific reference to humans. This vision of the globe makes plain that Earth is not humanity's alone. We share it with other living beings, non-living matter, and forms of energy. The incongruity, the incompatibility between the two global ideas requires distinguishing between them. The human-centric global of globalization can remain the global globe. That's the familiar way of thinking about it. The Earth-centric global of global climate change is better understood as the planet or the planetary. The intellectual development of the concept of the planetary, the intensification of anthropogenic effects on the planet, human-generated effects on the planet like climate breakdown, and the development of a technosphere capable of sensing these effects together reveals our condition of planetarity, representing at once an ontological transformation, meaning a change in how and what things are and why they are that way, and also an epistemic break, a change in systems of knowledge with previous understandings of human positions of the planet. Oh, I think I've read all of it. Sorry,
That's
Ros.
fine. You're reading it so well. That's fine.
Sorry, we were going to share the reading, so Ros was going to do this bit, but my notes didn't match that. So, in addition, so I think the planetary seems to me to add another row to that table, which then looks more like this. All right, so this is like the modernity row. This is the post-modernity row. That's us approximately. This is the planet. It's not the globe and it's not the world. The scales it operates at are everything, all the scales at once, micro, meso, and macro. The question is, what is the era that we're in? This question mark can be answered by shit show. That's fair. That's kind of the real-time version of it. It's also, in relation to talk I was doing for Lawrence Leck's exhibition, we could think of this as sino-modernity. It's the Anthropocene. Like, this is still undecided. The agent, we don't yet know what the agent is. Probably many agents to do with the different scales and how they work with each other. So there might be more contingency in that agent than there has been in the other framings. And we don't know what the art of this time is. Okay? And my sense is that we're probably somewhere on this line here between contemporary art and the next thing. So this is the challenge. And we said earlier that these talks are about presenting a common challenge for all of us working in the art space. I don't think we as tutors know what we're heading into because it's a very large problem, but all we can do is start informing ourselves about how to think around this. So the series of talks gives some indicators for how to address the planetary or planetarity according to some of its scales. And each of the talks will probably operate at a different one of these scales. And I think across the talks we'll probably have a multi-scalar, some introduction to kind of multi-scalar thinking. We're going to try and find a way of traversing or orienting ourselves through this notion of planetarity, not as a unified or established concept, but according to its plurality, hence planetarity in the plural. Okay? So with that, I want to introduce the first speaker, Zhexi Zhang. We've had a little bit of a fight about what we should call this talk. So it's contemporary art, the 21st century, and we weren't sure whether it should be in, and, versus, against, and so on and so forth, but we decided with in, because it sort of seems to cover most things. So Gary, to introduce him, Gary lives and works between London and Shanghai. He's a visual artist and a writer exploring systemic connections between cosmology, technology, and economy. This is some of his work here. So the film The Tourist is based on the history of Zanzibar since decolonization into globalization, and Zanzibar is a kind of site for many nested interests operating simultaneously. He's also edited recently a book of fictions, essays, and interviews about finance and time, catastrophe time from 2003. Been involved with Waste Paper Opera's production Dead Cat Bounce with Clara Coffin and James. Clara's over here as well this evening. This was at Somerset House in 2022. And recent solo exhibitions include Metamers at EPFL in Lausanne, 11th Asian Art Biennial. And Gary's also co-author of Future Art Ecosystems produced by the Serpentine in 2022 and 24, I think. And is currently authoring a report on art and technology in China for the British Council. So Gary's also working on a book about multipolar technoculture and developing a new commission for the Powerhouse Museum in Parramatta. So with that, Gary's going to talk about contemporary art in the 21st century, and then we'll return, if he doesn't cover it explicitly, to the conversation around the planetary in the Q&A afterwards. All right, thank you, Gary.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rahel and Roz. Thanks for inviting me to begin this series, which seemed initially a bit like an invitation to make some kind of provocation. Yeah, so I'll just kind of dive right in. I've been talking a lot today because of teaching, so I've kind of written down everything, like all the points that I wanted to say throughout the narrative, so I'll just keep on track that way. This is a still from, wait, what's going on? Sahel? Why did the screen go away?
I don't know. It should be working.
Right. Well, let me unplug and replug it again. It seemed to just pop up last time.
Hold on, let me try it. Yeah, it should be.
Let me try that again.
No, the projector's gone off.
Oh, the projector's gone off.
All right, so it's going to take a few minutes to sort out. This is.
Maybe they could go to the bar first, and then we can have a live Q&A.
It seems to be on. That flashing implies a kind of like I'm turning on now kind of thing.
Yeah.
LG.02, isn't it?
Sorry?
LG.02, yeah.
Sorry about that. Oh no, it's on.
It's
okay.
okay.
All right,
We're
it's
here.
on.
We're
It's
here.
on. It's okay. It's going to work.
Okay.
Just give it a minute to warm up, I think. So that was the projector telling us welcome to Goldsmiths. There you go.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so I'll just go right into it. So the talk is called Contemporary Art in the 21st Century. It was also briefly going to be called Contemporary Art and the 21st Century. Either way, it is about, to an extent, what is contemporary art? What are the conditions in which it was born? What does it look like today? What are its constituents, demographics, its ethos? And then secondly, what is the 21st century? Where are we now that we are, at least maybe 50 years into the era that could be thought about in terms of contemporary art? I usually think of it in terms of like post-60s conceptualism going into kind of like 80s commercialism kind of confluence, and then really blowing up during the fairs era of like the art fairs and the globalization of Frieze and Basel and everything after the 90s, which maybe we don't think about here that much, but actually does, pay a lot of people's bills. Okay, so contemporary art as we know it, the practices, discursive canons, political cultures, thematic preoccupations, was born in a particular historical era, loosely the canonical construct. Artistically, we can think about art school, the kind of broad syllabus you get there, the modernism of the early 20th century, late 19th if you're pushing it into like the idea of the autonomous, art for art's sake, art having a certain kind of revolutionary potential as a force of social transformation, but also something that was kind of autonomously formal, standing outside of social reproduction. That moving into roughly periodizing, obviously none of this is smooth and easy. You move from Paris to New York into postmodernity, conceptualism, and then in the kind of late end of that, we get something like contemporary art. which then does also kind of loop back to Duchamp, and I feel like every 101 usually starts with Duchamp still. Historically, I'm talking more I would think of as the historical canon that art discourse generally addresses, but also, this is not the entire 20th century, but in terms of like the core canon of contemporary art, and the humanities to an extent, like comp lit would probably follow this as well. The Russian Revolution, World War II, Hiroshima, the kind of horror of technological warfare, but also the birth of cybernetics and the birth of the information age, the kind of, the dream of annihilation, the kind of, the questioning of humanism, the kind of first, I guess, foregrounding of the earth and the ecological as both something that was kind of part of humanity's fundamental inhumanity in terms of its ability to annihilate, and also as part of its interconnectedness with, like, into the 1960s, Rachel Carson and Earthrise and all of this. And then post-colonialism and the Cold War. I mean, I'm lumping these two together because a significant part of the discourse really emerges out of the, I guess, mostly the post-war period, although, I mean, I think something like the number of countries in the world goes from something like 70 to about 170 between 1918 and 1970. So this is a period where all the independences from the British Empire, from Southeast Asia, also later the USSR, Yugoslavia, and so on, kind of take place. And that is, I've been very interested in that period myself, that whole phase myself recently, because you have this kind of era where constitutions are being scribbled left, right, and center, and like all these kinds of new optimisms are appearing because these new identities are forming at a national scale. You also have other identity issues which are very kind of resonant now, because you have something like post-war West Berlin German youths who want to be anything but German after the Second World War, and then pitch their part in with the Third Worldist movement and so on. And this kind of like, this moment of like either embracing certain forms of like identities which are assumed to be the unit of politics in the global scheme, as well as the potential kind of eradication or cleansing of suppression or abdication of certain forms of identity, all happens around this era, You also have things like the fact that most of Africa becomes independent around this era, and I ended up making that film about Zanzibar, but one of the weird things that happens with Zanzibar and Africa, it's an insignificant story except for the threads of it, which lead the African independences in 1972 to significantly push China into the UN Security Council and to replace Taiwan ROC as China's primary representative. It's in 72 or 71. And that was, for better or worse, part of this changing demographic shift in the members of the global parliament in the form of the UN, for instance. And at the same time, you have the Cold War. I won't go into the kind of like techno-liberal kind of American forces going on there, but maybe importantly, a somewhat less attended to story would be the kind of relationship between Cold War and global modernism, which some of you probably know a bit about. The way in which everyone from the CIA to the kind of JFK administration, gifted and pushed a lot of what was considered to be the exemplar of Western liberal culture, mostly through places like West Berlin. And also, there's the famous PSYOP joke version of it is like CIA pushed Jackson Pollock across Europe. There was a great film recently called Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat by incredible filmmaker called Johan Grimonprez, who I feel like is not well known enough, who is about three of the jazz greats. I want to say it's Nina Simone and Louis Armstrong, and there's a third one. Is it Dizzy? Might be the USB. Taken on tour to, I think, the Congo around or before the time of Patrice Lumumba's assassination, as a kind of show of force of, global American soft power. And so, I'm personally, I need to look more into this, but very much interested in the extent to which contemporary art is a kind of afterglow of this great push of liberalism around the world, which is not to reduce it to that, but, how much of contemporary art globally in maybe places that some of you guys come from was the result of the Goethe Institute's activity and funding to kind of move people between the global south and Berlin, for instance. And then liberal globalism, free trade, post-1980s, neoliberal world order, all these buzzwords you've probably heard before. I mean, this is obviously very, very kind of simplified. Culturally, Frankfurt School, critique of mass culture, Walter Benjamin, the kind of another like text of like, I guess, art school, I would say normally, like the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And this kind of has something to do, I think, one of art's kind of core kind of positions with technology inheriting from the 20th century into, I guess, the thinking around language, post-structuralism and cultural studies, the question of the kind of untethering of language from culture as such, as a system of signs. My sort of quiet take here is that LLMs have basically completed the project of post-structuralism. Then you go into institutional critique as one particular model where it's a kind of a critical relationship of art to itself, to its, Hans Hacker in the 60s looking at real estate, all the way into Andrea Fraser, and like all these great thinkers who are kind of taking this kind of, I guess, like a formalistic critique of art as an infrastructural and institutional phenomenon. And then later, I think culturally, identity or identity politics, identity as the kind of core terrain of artistic exploration and expression, and also critique, has been like very much the vogue in the last 15 years, maybe. And then politically, this is like the kind of more the political compass, the oppositions. From the 20th century, we obviously inherit capitalism and communism as a key opposition, again, reflecting back to that Cold War discussion. Humanism and technocracy, again, I think owing for itself partly from the liberalism, the East-West debates to a great extent, the ability to program socially, to kind of socially engineer society, or to manage it, in other words, or to plan it, in other words, as opposed to rely on an open marketplace system. The critique of neoliberalism has been a pretty core preoccupation of contemporary art, probably for as long as most people here have been born. And then again, identity politics as a kind of key political terrain, various forms of post-colonial kind of politics, but also the kind of like subjective positions around gender and, or structural positions around gender and race, but also various forms of kind of like inter-subjective positions within, especially I think diasporic kind of communities in the kind of, let's say the foothills of the center of empire, like places like this, where the globe comes and mixes. Okay, so I'm gonna go through it in terms of 4 basic claims about this kind of canonical construct, and maybe speak a tiny bit less than I have. The first claim: the grounding, historical, socio-political, and economic conditions of this canonical construct have largely fallen away in the early 21st century. So basically I'm saying that like a lot of this, while being definitely important historically, is slowly falling away as the core terrain upon which culture and discourse is effected, and on which agency is made. I mean, while sure the US at the moment might kind of like can restart a kind of communist McCarthyist discourse, but that's really not the terrain of political battle today, for example. Second claim, I'll go through these in more detail. Second claim: the political and aesthetic character of contemporary art results from the world of this canonical construct. So the ethos, if you like, the sort of general consensus that typically forms in a space such as this, in a space such as an art biennial, in a space such as a museum panel discussion, or another gathering of globally minded contemporary artists. This also revolves around and results from the world implied by that construct that we were just talking about. The third claim: the role of the contemporary artist is the product of a social contract embedded within this. I think this gets to more the kind of like material relationships within this form. I mean, I'm basically talking about the way in which the contemporary artist as the model is both dependent upon and kind of co-constituted with certain forms of the market and social democracy, which are very much dependent on a certain idea of how the state will treat you, and that has been shown to be quite changeable in recent years. And so we're kind of left a bit flailing and cornered in some sense. Fourth claim, the crisis, or if you like, a crisis of contemporary art, the kind of, if you like, just say the overturning that we might be seeing today is not just one of time, like of something, you know, some like things pass and like particular movements fade, but it's also one of geography and geo-imagination. And this has maybe slightly more to do with the question of planetarity, which has to do with fundamentally the assertion of the very valid and deeply justifiable assertion of many different histories into the cultural field, into the kind of hegemony of like a certain US-led unipolar global cultural order. So, first claim, grounding conditions of this construct have largely fallen away in the 21st century. I'll run through these fairly quickly. As Suhail just kind of discussed, and Roz, from the global to the planetary. I mean, in my interest in this is from, in a sense, the post-Second World War US-centered economic and trade global multilateral order, which also came with the birth of various multilateral institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, the BIS, and the gradual shift in power between these. I mean, these things aren't just going away. That's not. But certainly, the UN has been significantly undermined in terms of its kind of legitimacy and kind of political authority in recent years. I mean, I see the short pattern that we've seen for quite a while is that, you know, okay, we're all going to play by the rules until the most powerful players in the game get also affected potentially by the rules or don't like the way the rules are being applied, and then you get problems. And so this particular multilateral world order, in which China is also now, I think, seemingly quite willing to participate in, to kind of like take hold of rather than try and replace, especially with things like the WTO, is dramatically changing. That really has to do with the decline or the kind of receding influence and shifting political stance of the US. And towards something more like a planetary interdependency, because simply we are independent. The problems, the crises that are being faced by different nations and peoples are significantly materially, whether in terms of supply chains, resources, or climates, dependent on each other. And I think this, you know, there is a sort of deglobalization from the capital G globalization of the 1980s, but there isn't really a deglobalization in the sense that we're going to all like just go into COVID mode and like kind of shore up into our own countries. It's a question of like redrawing the relationships, the kind of slime mold shrinking in and finding new kind of connections. War, climate, and stuff, I mean like material, matter stuff, climate, energy transition, which sort of unravels the political compass. And this is related to the first thought, the end of the first thought there. I mean, it's about how the political compass that we're kind of familiar with from the 20th century has been dramatically kind of overturned or just kind of like put in a washing machine for a while. And so now you have, you know, this is obviously a meme, but you have a previous Al-Qaeda member being interviewed by David Petraeus, the CIA head, I believe, CIA director, or maybe a four-star general when they were running the operations in Iraq, in a sort of friendly Davos audience. You have, like, you know, American Maoism, like especially after Charlie Kirk, I thought like there was a lot of like a real cultural revolution energy in the American discourse. And you have obviously Chinese capitalism and so on. Labor politics, there has been, just practically speaking, the decimation of organized labor. That was a key force, a key piece of leverage in the 20th century. Personally, I think we should be pretty concerned about what AI does to the kind of organization and division of labor and the prior interdependencies and forms of leverage that different parts of society could have and could exert on each other despite power imbalances. Now is really kind of torn apart. There's the extent to which I think the kind of actual discourse of class politics in this country has become almost a kind of a matter of subculture rather than a matter of organization. And alongside that, this last kind of 50-year period has seen like a significant shift towards an asset-based financial economy in which every worker is entwined mostly into like basically S&P 500 American asset prices through pension funds, through housing, through governments and bond markets, as opposed to the kind of traditional struggle around wages between workers and owners, for instance. Technology and culture. So institutional media and culture has for some years now, maybe since 2010 or so, been significantly downstream of social platforms that curate the kind of media that we are consuming and immersed in, and increasingly of AI, which is machine learning into LM era kind of stuff, has been like one of the organizing forces of culture, and also has turned in some ways, in an exciting way, turned everyone into a sort of producer of culture, a content creator. I mean, you could certainly see certain positives to that, but at the same time is locked into this kind of race to the bottom attention economy that makes everything very, very, very cursed. And then East and West, contingent terms, but the rise of China, the de facto kind of massive modernization of China over the last 50 years, and the threat to Western main character syndrome reframes global political priorities, because the Western stance around China and around much of the rising global South has always been this question of develop, but don't develop too much. Don't start feeling like a threat. Remain an emerging market where we can buy stuff from, but don't start changing our trade flows, and then also do so on our terms, follow WTO rules as we set them, etc. And then finally, the welfare state. Austerity, very visible in this country over the last 15 years. And also Staatsräson, which is the German idea of the telos, or the reason for the being of the state, which was recently deployed within the war in Gaza, which basically made it part of the perhaps part of the constitution, was it constitutional, of the German state to be an ally of Israel, has significantly darkened the social contract of Western social democracy, i.e. there's a huge disparity between what has been enshrined by the state and what is the political beliefs of a great number of the citizens. And also massively delegitimized its power and legitimacy, and moral legitimacy in particular, on the global stage, because increasingly you have these situations where very small parts of the West and a few Polynesian islands where the US has military bases are basically the 6 people in the UN voting one way while everybody else condemns genocide on the other. So you have this kind of very stark kind of image. Okay, second claim. How are we doing? Okay, second claim. The political and aesthetic character of contemporary art results from the world of a canonical construct. So on one hand, we have the humanistic critique, or the accelerationist kind of embrace, and also kind of pseudo-critique and assimilation to technology. I mean, I'm thinking here everything from, the sort of surveillance critique works of the last 20 years to kind of the biennial and the kind of the sort of accelerationist kind of aesthetics that came out of the post-internet era, where artists were really interestingly playing with ways of thinking through the kind of encroachment of cyberculture of the online into everything. All of this, still matters, but it's also kind of just the norm. It's kind of just the new normal. So in this famous phrase, everything is computer. The critique on neoliberal capitalism, it's basically stopped making sense. I mean, the critique can still, the critique still makes sense, but the actual terrain in which the critique makes a difference relative to the kind of terrain of where, global development is headed, where the fortunes of developed liberal, like free market countries are going, there's just an increasingly huge disparity in terms of where things are actually mattering in terms of production, in terms of what the planetary is evolving into, and this kind of particular critique of the free market, which has been very present over the last 30 years or so. And I mean, people like Quinn Slobodian will write very interestingly about not the kind of question of the critique of neoliberalism, but the way in which that has actually been very much part and parcel of the emerging forms of fascism and libertarian kind of thought that are now taking hold in various parts of the world. And at the same time, practically speaking, it's just shifting. Trump's defunded US aid. It's like the reach of American soft power is kind of pulling away. We had Doge earlier in the year. The US is now basically stalling the World Trade Organization rather than enforcing it. Gigantic tariffs everywhere, trade war with China and everyone else. They recently put 100K thresholds on hiring H-1B visas, which is most software engineers from India, for example. And so this idea that we're still in a world where neoliberalism is the guiding principle to hegemonic power is massively undermined by what's the politics of the last 10 years, really, including under Biden, who continued Trump 1.0's industrial policy and trade war with China. Post-critique of authenticity and reproduction, which I guess is thinking a little bit like something that's at the heart of contemporary art, whether it's the kind of critical complicity of, think of a Bernadette Corporation, or even going back to an artist placement group, and thinking more forward into K-Hole and various kind of Kristen McClendon Thomas, I guess, and various sort of artistic kind of assimilationist and accelerationist movements of the last 10, 15 years, which have owed an awful lot to this place in many ways. As well as the kind of critique of authenticity in itself, the kind of the sort of, let's say, atavistic humanism of saying, okay, we can actually just leave all of this behind and form a kind of a commune away from what is essentially the large part of world society. Both of these positions have essentially, I think, been kind of transcended. Then the critique of Western Enlightenment, i.e. the kind of core of, I guess, post-colonial thinking, as well as, I guess, something that's become much more generalized in the last 10, 15 years. Critically important in a lot of ways, but also has just largely been outflanked by the global ecological and technological developmentalism in the global south. Rather than this kind of critique of the colonial condition, what we see is now actually, China, India, parts of the Gulf asserting forms of sovereignty from the global south, global majority positions, which are actually quite different from the kind of theoretical positions of the kind of the sort of post-colonial diasporas of the last 50 years or so. And then at the same time, we see these new kind of alliances forming, where BRICS has been along for a long time, Shanghai Cooperation, Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the collapse of the African development aid model, which is basically the shift away from US development aid or World Bank development aid as a model for African growth, which is coming very much from Africans. It's the deep, overwhelming skepticism and cynicism towards the debt-fueled kind of aid model, despite the similarly but less deep skepticism of Chinese infrastructure building. Is just a practical political reality faced by people in Tanzania, in Nigeria, who wants to build infrastructure. And then the kind of, I guess, the thinking around the more than human. I think this is also one that's also kind of just been taken over by reality. Which is not to say that the thinking around the more than human is not relevant, it's just too relevant It's like the world is so enchanted and so confusingly short of obvious human agency that the forms of kind of like somewhat fuzzy kind of vibrant matter era thinking around this now feel kind of very quaint to me. We can talk about this, but yeah, I mean, we're scrolling through genocide, and the witching is happening, and the witches are all fascists. This is just I don't even know Jaco Palazzo. So he's a nice kind of meme poet of this contemporary art form. This is just one of his little things. It's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as an art form. And then the question, I think one of the most interesting questions today is like cosmopolitanism, but which world? What version of the world? Is that world reconcilable? What does it mean to belong to a world rather than a nation, an ethnicity, or indeed just a particular disaster condition, but a particular one, rather than all of them at once? Like, what does it mean to be a cosmopolitan? Which, again, I think was at the core, one of the core identity characteristics of the contemporary artist is a form of cosmopolitanism, right? Like to be able to, I think we had this high point in the early 2010s with the Okoye Mweso's biennial, and with I think the documentary of that kind of era, with the kind of Hakave era of like encyclopedic exhibitions. But we seem to be in a very different time now. I mean, running through all of this, the main example that we can probably think about most easily in recent memory is, of course, Documenta 15. I mean, most of you are probably familiar with this story, right? So we don't need to go too deeply into it. Are you? If I say the controversy around Documenta 15, how many people put their hands up and say, I've heard of this? Okay, about half. Okay. Oh, God. Very short version. Documenta Quintenni, 5-yearly art festival. Another post-war kind of gift, I think, like a very major, huge amounts of money goes into it. Kind of like the serious person's Venice Biennial in some sense, in the sense of its kind of global prestige. And held in Kassel in Germany, small post-industrial town, city. And in 2021, too, I can't remember, they invited an Indonesian collective called Ruang Grupa to curate the biennial, curate the show, and they brought, essentially there was this feeling of like, bring the global south to Kassel. Like, Ruang Grupa is famous for being a collective, works very much all about like collective practice. They toured the world and found all of these different collectives from like Africa to Palestine to Latin America to wherever else, and like brought all of these practices into Documenta Halle and Kassel. And there's this kind of, I guess, spirit of like those themes around this idea of the lumbung, which was some kind of food sharing kind of practice in sort of farming collectivism. And then, so at least my read on it has always been we welcome the global south, the global majority, to the most prestigious art exhibition in the world. And then at the first moment of it, maybe even before it opened, I can't remember, there was a mural which was this kind of done by this collective called Taring Padi, also an Indonesian collective, to do basically like big agitprop kind of murals. And there was a part of it which was interpreted as anti-Semitic, and that became the kind of beginning theme of the downfall of the entire show, but not the entire show, but also the entire institution. I mean, this was kind of a pretty solid preempting of the current Germany-Gaza discourse, for better or worse. There were also Palestinian collectives showing, this is a question of funding, who basically had violence-threatening graffiti scribbled on their walls. And it became this kind of We'll return to it in a second later, but it became this kind of like, okay, we welcome everyone to our door, but not like that. Yeah, we want you to speak, but speak in the way which we find to be civil, palatable, in a language that we find acceptable here in the place where we've so graciously allowed you to arrive. I mean, this is the kind of overall narrative, at least that I drew from it. Of course, there are lots of micropolitics in this. You know, there is a sort of anti-Semitic element to the particular caricature that was drawn in this. I can't remember exactly what it was, like a citizen sort of poems or something. A pig wearing a helmet with the word Mossad on it. Israel's National Intelligence Agency, so there's a kind of like Jewish conspiracy Mossad kind of thing going on. And so we'll come back to that a little bit later. The third claim, the role of the contemporary artist is a product of the social contract embedded in the canonical constructs. So the role of the artist is this now notionally autonomous, like a figure of autonomy, a figure of alterity, operating outside the mode of production. Then that kind of ideal of the artist as a certain type of social or kind of parasocial kind of figure, and versus the professionalization of art and its cooptation by a wider creative class and speculative capital. So the artist is also the hustler is also the entrepreneur is also the kind of the person who like proves their worth by going out and expresses themselves, and this kind of generalized condition as a kind of ideological space throughout a wide breadth of I guess contemporary neoliberal culture or something. This was itself in many ways like enabled by the post-war social democratic welfare states. So thinking about like various post-war structures like the Arts Council, the Goethe Institute. The Goethe Institute, interestingly, was actually a rebranding of the Deutsche Academy as a way to kind of step away from the Germanness, or like hail back to an earlier Germanness, a better Germanness in like 1951, I think. To again kind of like choose which history we want to kind of belong to when we think of ourselves as an identity and be able to feel good about ourselves. German culture post-October 7th, I don't know, most of you probably are aware of the kind of insane amount of like censorship and repression around the German cultural sphere after October 7th, especially in Berlin, which obviously is a quite strong mixture of like Turkish, Arab, German, cosmopolitan Berlinites. But then you've got like German anti-Deutsch politics and this kind of very complicated relationship between leftism and Israel. And also the US natural endowment of the arts under Trump. I think I have an image here. Oh no, I have an image related to the Germany thing. Yeah, this is just there. I mean, even before October 7th, long before, this is an image of Walid Rua, the artist who refused to, the Lebanese artist who refused to withdraw his support for BDS and therefore was disinvited by a huge German art prize. I can't remember which. Cosmopolitan contemporary artist as a representative mediator between the center and emerging periphery of Western hegemonic world order has become very complicated. I mean, by this I mean like the way in which, if we look at the art history of China, but also of any number of places around the world, what you have is essentially very often the artist as a representation of either cultural specificity versus cosmopolitan order, or the artist as a representative of native development at home, but in the cosmopolitan. So I mean, and this makes sense. This is just part of the historical story of contemporary art. Has I guess I'm a bit more familiar with the history of like Chinese contemporary art, and if you look at the artists of the 90s, they are important and fascinating documents of this kind of blinding era of cultural and economic development. If you look at certain artists and filmmakers like Jia Zhangke, or like early works by like my name's already running away from me right now. A lot of it was like artists were these explorers of the fringes and the sort of blinding pace of transition of a society, and then they brought that to Venice, and then they brought that to global museums. I mean, even yesterday there was a beautiful piece by in this new institution, Le Bras, by Ibrahim Kahama, which was, again, like a work which basically indexes global trade and logistics and kind of colonial histories by bringing jute sacks from Ghanaian markets into a very, very, very expensive house in Fitzrovia. But this relationship, this for a while tenable relationship, as a kind of like representation of a representative of the global into the metropole or the cosmopole, is now also being importantly complicated by basically more assertive players coming from everywhere else. And then, you know, I just saw today that the outgoing director of MoMA is becoming the main advisor for the Saudi Islamic art biennial. You know, the flow is going the other way. Like, it was only a few years ago where like people would not have necessarily gone to the Gulf, and now like it's a much more accepted kind of thing, which, you know, I think is understandable, because we are looking at lots of different kind of political and economic orders, and they're bringing their histories and bringing their unapologetic kinds of identities into this cosmopolitan game. But it certainly doesn't look like everyone is going to New York again. The artist is flaneur and as aesthetic decision maker, as cultural catalyst or MSG, okay, undermined by algorithmic attention economy, entrepreneurialism. Sorry, this is really a note form, I realize. So the sort of generalization of the creative class, the idea that everyone is a curator, artist, and creative, is also part of this social contract, sort of like, let's say, the late neoliberal period or something. And then acceleration of technological innovation in cultural content production, like the fact that we are significantly content producers run by the algorithms now. All of these things are part of this kind of, the ability for artists to exist in the way that we have typically come to understand them. The fourth claim, the crisis of contemporary art is not about time, but also geography and geo-imagination. I've already touched on this. But the idea that the art, as Rahel mentioned earlier, was in a way born under the star of the end of history, and now history has kind of returned. Like, we're no longer looking at this idea that everyone is just going to slowly turn into a version of like the USA circa 1999. Even though it's important to remember, most of the world wanted to be the USA circa 1999, right? No, there's nothing the Chinese emerging middle class wanted more than to be a suburban American in the era of like rapid economic development, and arguably they're doing it better now. If you look at the cars, liberal democracy in the kind of, I put quotations around this. Obviously, we have to, you know, Gulf War and stuff. Is in a degenerative phase. Populism is on the rise all over the place. The assertion, all over the West especially, the assertion of universalisation of Europe and US historical subjectivity has turned it into a non-universalizable condition. Again, the UN maps kind of do this. Multipolar state power and oligarchical networks assert themselves over and above neoliberal consensus. You know, everything from the Russian war, which, you know, for the longest time, the German consensus was that Russia could not possibly pull something like this because they were building up a relationship through gas pipelines. The fact that they were becoming economically interlinked, independent of each other, meant that surely politics was, you know, deprioritized. They did not, you know, they underestimated Putin's historical imagination. I like this. You see this video where someone where he turns up in heaven and he's like, oh, it's fine. I just didn't realize it was going to be Chinese. You're in heaven. Non-Western historical cosmologies and material realities assert themselves over Western cultural hegemony, including diasporic imaginaries. So I'm thinking of like different kinds of events I've already kind of covered, documented 15, Belt and Road Initiative on the infrastructural level, global soft culture power plays, it's going to say, or no, soft power plays, you're right. So we're thinking here in terms of like Dubai and Saudi, and both players are significantly extending their investments and like participation in this kind of global cultural field. I believe this, like the Sharjah Foundation is also, for example, extending a lot of cultural investment across North and East Africa. I mean, even in London this month, we've got like 4 foundations opening, big quite moneyed non-profits with millionaire money behind them. We've got a Chinese one, an Arab one, a Lithuanian one by the guy behind Vinted, and a sort of Russian-connected one, which is a bit broader. And then I've also something to watch out for. As many of you maybe have this year. It's the first year of I think the big global Bukhara biennial. Uzbekistan is a good case study for anyone who's interested in the way in which a small country which was not very present, let's say, on the global cultural scene, has poured investments, first into essentially communication consultancies and then into kind of curatorial force, and then it doesn't, after you've done that, it doesn't actually cost that much to bring the curators in. And then architects, museums, and so on. To kind of very rapidly build up, essentially, become a point on the map, another kind of stop on the curatorial calendar in the kind of global biennial scene. And so, part of the crisis relates to this fact that multiculturalism and to an extent cosmopolitanism, whichever 0.0, looked an awful lot in retrospect like globalism on European and American terms. Adam actually makes a nice point in relation to something like this in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which you might have, if you ever worked in some kind of institution in the last 10, how many years? I can't remember. The SDGs were, pretty much universally acknowledged as things that everyone was happy to reach for. But then when you think about the realities of some of the SDGs, it really has to do with maintaining the current order of things. It really has to do with maintaining the current relationship between Western investment and global resources. And WTO similarly, WTO is a weird one because China joined in 2001, and everyone was kind of that was the kind of taming of China, of bringing China into a global free trade order. And then by, I think, about 5 years ago, you had situations where China was trying to kind of make the US play by the rules. The situation had kind of reversed. And then closer to home in the art space, we have this kind of fissures within some of the art world's most kind of esteemed institutions. You have the firing by the money people behind the Art Forum, behind the editor, David Velasco, for having a signature on a letter, not even making a statement or something. And then they've recently hired a respectable curator who's mostly known for being an advocate of digital art and NFTs. I think probably in a relatively cynical play towards that particular moment. But now that, for example, Christie's I think recently closed the NFT wing, so I wouldn't be surprised about Art Forum getting relatively soon either. I also just like this image. This is an image of the Iranian president in the late 90s on CNN, a sort of quite important interview, suggesting that most Americans have in fact read Alexis de Tocqueville, who's this late 18th or late 19th century, early 19th century French writer who kind of basically toured the US and wrote a book called Democracy in America, this kind of almost sort of philosophical ethnographic account of early American society was developed and is an important kind of historical text. Actually, there's a Wang Huning, for those of you who know, in China, who's one of the leading figures in the current Xi Jinping administration, did his own version of this called America Against America in 1988-9, where he did 6 months in the US and kind of almost like an ethnographer alien kind of observes the different dynamics in American society, and in many ways it's incredibly admiring. The question is how can we be like this? How did these people develop so quickly? How are their technologies so good? How is their economy so active? But he also identifies the kind of deep class and race divide in America and says we can't be having this. When he goes home, basically. This is the UN stuff I was talking about. You look, it's basically the US and a few close allies over in chronological order over the last 2 years or so being against. My favorite one is the bottom middle one, which the US is the only country to vote against the International Day of Hope, which is like a purely symbolic. I can't remember the exact reasoning, but they had a reasoning. But it's like it's just one. It's amazing. Okay, we're going to cover this in a short time. So, why contemporary art is becoming increasingly cornered at its current self-relationship, its current image of itself. Not to say artists can't do things, not to say that art doesn't exist. Those two things are both true. But relationship to the state, the kind of critical insider or the kind of social democratic infrastructure, broadly speaking, relationship to the global, a kind of adherence or a kind of agent of Western liberal cosmopolitanism, relationship to power and capital, a kind of deep rejectionism without alternative. I mean, this is something I think that does come up, which gets a little bit thornier in certain things, which I think like the political instincts, a kind of marriage of very good resources developed, let's say, from Foucault and second wave feminism about the private being political, about kind of relationship to power. It's amazing how often we have to reach for Joe Friedman again, who wrote this important text in the 70s called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, and the ability the organization and the responsibility to wield power and to organize is still core, despite the fact that power itself can be oppressive and power can be something that is wielded malignly. So this kind of rejectionism, I kind of sometimes think about this as like, kind of, everyone wants to be a sort of dictator with their own version of a utopia. So relations to social production, I would argue the modern artist, contemporary artist also has a fundamentally non-productive relationship to society in a good way. I mean that in the sense of like it's not part of the conventions of social reproduction, but us actually able to kind of weave in and out, go between, be a kind of free electron between those kind of spaces, and to therefore kind of comment on and transcend parts of it. But also always in tension with valorization, with the markets, with all other forms of capital, with social capital, with a kind of like discursive capital. Relationship to political representation, lately a kind of like progressivism versus via a certain kind of identitarian politics, which has become very thorny. And this is also all fine. This is cool. Like keep on doing this. That's cool. But then sometimes the state turns against you, which has happened in Germany, in the UK, and America. Relation to the global, well, whose global are you talking to? Like, is the version of the world that contemporary art is kind of concerned with actually an increasingly shrinking island of a certain kind of like networks in cosmopolitan and populace, which is becoming increasingly ignorant to the way in which the world is actually changing, and what history will be defined by in this Q2. Relationship to power capital, Western liberalism has gone mask off recently in relation to like post-Gaza especially, the kind of like closing ranks of the West in the face of genocide has been, will not be forgotten by the rest of the world for the next century, I don't think. Relationship to social production, austerity state demanding art compensate for social cuts. I never really read a really good solid analysis of it, but anyone who's dealt with the Arts Council or dealt with kind of various aspects of public art infrastructure in the UK will presumably have dealt with this idea that, okay, seemingly it's just kind of coincidentally alongside 15 years of like closing of social programs, youth programs, education programs, basically the kind of social side of the welfare state with austerity, also became this kind of demand for artists and art spaces to kind of offer up themselves as sort of band-aids to this. I mean, there's an artist who's working with, I remember recently having a conversation, I won't name any names, with an artist who was basically having to work with, take a commission, because you have to take a commission, but work with very vulnerable people. And in a way, they were not volunteering to do this. They were simply presented with the fact, oh, you can have this commission, but actually the commission is with like so-and-so, which, and you're basically giving like a sort of untrained and unready sort of person, this kind of very vulnerable task, and that seems to speak for like a lot of different like patch holes in our current kind of social infrastructure. Relationship to political representation, the cultural wars have, I think, this is contentious, but an evolution towards a kind of hyper-subjectivity. Everyone's like an autofiction writer. And then eventually you get to this situation where you're kind of like fighting amongst minorities of one. The US also has massive DEI cuts, the DEI being the programs for diversity, inclusion, and equality. I was speaking to a US artistic director person recently, and one of the issues in terms of US cultural funding has been that the arts sector did significantly end up tying itself to the ship of DEI in terms of where it actually got its sponsorship from. And now, in the Trump administration, basically every DEI partner is being thrown away from corporations. And now this is more of a strategic issue than a question of whether DEI is important. And then like weaponized small bean politics, I mean cancel culture, and it's like, I mean, when I say weaponized small bean, I mean this. I mean like, for instance, the fact that we've come to a late realization that a certain politics of trauma, while of course valid in its kind of center ground, can be leveraged, and the language of it can be leveraged quite powerfully for politically quite kind of suspect reasons, ideological reasons, I suppose, yeah. I enjoy this meme. Oh yeah, so what happened with Documenta was, along after the shit show of the thing itself, where I think Ron Gruber and various others were dragged before German parliament and like scolded all around, Documenta has almost kind of been beaten out of existence, and then they formed a new committee, and the new committee was the independent global thinkers who independent global thinkers and curators who would choose the next director. But then they found out that a brown person did something they didn't like, i.e. signed another petition that in some way, I think quite tendentiously advocated for either BDS or Gaza. And then they fired him, they fired one of the new committee. Everyone else had to resign as well, because what else can you do? You can't like, you have to stand with your colleague, or at least you can't like stand with the German state that has just basically censored the people they themselves chose to be the experts. And then they brought in, I mean, this is the part of the weaponization of a kind of like different histories at this moment. Then they brought in the director of Naomi Beckwith, the director of the, I think, Whitney Museum in New York, who then brought in 4, let's say, globally distributed, or a bit more American female curators. And yeah, it's like, as I always write, I think I tried to articulate it once in a random story note, so I just read it here. The ones who take the poison chalice are invariably irrelevant, such as the art form situation, or etc. Contemporary arts doom spiral into high-minded slop. What Rahel Aima has called emotional support biennials. Still, we should celebrate women of color taking up space for pro-genocide ways of knowing. I feel sorry for everyone involved. And then this guy, I don't know who that is, Andy Olsen-Patz. I know who that is. Made quite a good carousel of memes. The Whitney ISP is another grand exemplary contemporary art institution, the Whitney Independent Study Program, which doesn't still exist anymore. Has it been totally? Temporarily, right. But again, because the artists wanted to make some kind of political stand about genocide. And the sort of impunity and the kind of quickness with which this can happen. Yeah. So yeah, given the conditions laid out aforementioned, we have this kind of issue where the heart of contemporary art subjectivity is becoming that of a self-congratulating utopian with a diminishing stake in societies under technological and political and cultural transformation, a wannabe dictator clothed in radicalism, a bourgeois critic of power with no strategy for wielding it, a dependent on increasingly illiberal social democracy, a speaker of my truth representing a cosmopolitan minority of one while the world twists and burns. So that's kind of a caricature, obviously, but it's not like, to my mind, it's not so irrelevant to the average biennial wall text that promises the kind of like radical redistribution of the policies of care and so on. You mean the German situation is particularly tough right now because also I guess Germany has been one of the key like cornerstones of art, like global art, because its funding structures have always been very, very good. And now it's, if you're an artist in Berlin or in Germany, you're caught in this very, very, very difficult situation of how do you run a biennial that promises various forms of radical politics while not being able to address one of the maybe the burning issue in the world, which your state is also perpetuating. This is not an easy thing. This is a horrible situation. This is Michael Moore and Olivia Wilde in one of the first waves of anti-Trump protests, where they kind of just look. Oh, Mark Ruffalo as well in the back, where they're just being incredibly satisfied with themselves for shouting with the crowd. This is an amazing kind of image. Contemporary artistic subjectivity wants to survive this breakup with globalisation with its power and its dignity intact, its pockets full and its hands clean, its avant-gardism celebrated, its politics pure. But the sea change of the early 21st century has left it cornered on multiple fronts. So meanwhile, in the 21st century, we have, live shift 1.0, 2.0. What I'm thinking of here, if you don't follow this, but it's kind of annoying discourse, is live shift 1.0 came around 22 in the kind of mid-pandemic, where people started basically as a pushback against mostly American identity politics, and people just started sort of becoming much more contrarian. The fact that people like Barry Weiss, important, hideous, horrible New York Times previous columnists, who became in one sense very cancelled. Okay, no, live shift 1.0 was when people realized that you can make money from being cancelled, right? First, it was oh no, I will terrified being castigated and cancelled. Then the whole community, especially in the far right, but also elements of the kind of contrarian sort of left, realize that you can actually become very popular and profitable by being cancelled. And then actually Barry Weiss has just become, I think, the editor-in-chief of the chief political editor of CNN, which is kind of terrifying, genuinely horrifying. This person is one of the sort of most kind of far-right Zionist kind of figures in American public culture. She used to be. Anyway, so Live 2.0 I would say is post Elon Musk buying Twitter and post Trump 2.0, where it is just a cesspit out there, the open racism and the things that just out of some vague consensus around wanting to be human together that we wouldn't choose to say and sort of form huge viral opinion clouds around maybe 10 years ago are just pretty much constantly present online now. And it's not a question of moderation, it's more a question of the cultures that are kind of being authorized. Hence the vibe shifting, and there'll be more vibe shifts. Trump 2.0, Western identitarian revanchism. This was a wonderful post up on the National Endowment for the Humanities for the National Guard and American Heroes. If you're an American institution, you can get something like $500,000 to create work that kind of glorifies the American Revolution, the signing of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and so on. Sino-modernity rising, the indigestible fact in many ways, not least to many Chinese people themselves, understandably, that China is becoming, because of climate and global supply chain production and various resource chains, becoming the sort of materially the historical driver of at least the next 50 years. The only way we're going to get out of climate change is through Chinese renewable production, for instance. And that itself is going to have its entirely different energy politics of electrification, for instance, over and above the kind of oil politics of the last 100-odd years. And America is not going to stop being the world's greatest gas producer anytime soon. So we're going to see a kind of the traditional diagram of progressivism change quite significantly. Orientalism 2.0. By this, I actually don't mean a kind of critical Said kind of Orientalism exactly. I kind of mean the tricky facts that we are now seeing these various histories assert themselves in such a way which are just quite different in the historical cosmologies that they represent, that are not necessarily commensurable, and what you do with that friction are different. I mean, I think it genuinely can be extremely productive, but it is not a world in which we say, actually, at the end of the day, everything the same. It's increasingly the world seeming to me where we say, history really matters, and I think you've forgotten that little bit of history. I mean, the new incoming Japanese prime minister, I think, is quite far right, for instance. And that's going to probably have quite an effect on, let's say, China and Korea in the historical memory of the 20th century. So when I say Orientalism 2.0, I kind of mean that for Western subjects, what does it mean to look at a different modernity, a different modern history, such as the one in China from 1950, 1949 onwards, and say, okay, I think that is an alternative model, and it is fundamentally different in its relationship to spiritual and ethical and social values than the ones that we have cultivated over generations. And it is one that is emerging and kind of growing and proliferating and becoming successful in its own way. And this is like a question of historical cosmology in a way. And so what do you do with that difference? What do you do with the other? Is basically the question. Rather than how do we demonize the other, it doesn't necessarily need to be antagonism. What do you do with that? AI. Migration, obviously, very, very difficult for Europe, especially. But they're also very important in terms of how Asian development goes. Genocide, impunity, and barbarism. There is no floor anymore. And the MFA industrial complex is still going strong. Keeping everyone in work. These were just, and when I said there was no floor anymore, but also, I guess, partly the AI thing, partly the other things, these were 2 posts by the Department of Homeland Security in the US in the last month, I guess. One was a full trailer for Pokemon Go Catch 'em All relating to ICE deportation seizures. And the other was, TikTok deprecation of this is the thing we have to kind of come to understand that this is normal. Whatever the US government is on some level normal. It's on some level the dominant culture. And so what do we do with that? Okay, so minor bit of optimism at the end. For me, I think this is on some level not a terrible time for the practices and intelligences that make art. This kind of world of extraordinary difference and extraordinary uncertainty. And for me, partly art is about developing new concepts of reality and destabilizing old ones and kind of reconfiguring a sort of alchemy, if you like, a kind of reconfiguration of the real. And if anything, it's going too fast and it's going all around us. But there's a lot of work to be done. So I'd say that surprisingly, I feel it's actually kind of an incredible urgency for various forms of artistic investigation into this particular world. I would say also that the far right have kind of taken a lead on this. I think there's a reactionism that in the kind of current ether that the right have been incredibly good at latching onto, both in highly techno-accelerationist advanced ways and in the most atavistic. But they've been really good at imagining alternative futures, in a way that also I think arguably lifts certain parts of its playbook from postmodernism, from you want narrative collapse, you want kind of the kind of collapse of grand narratives and the resurgence of all these kind of minor kind of floating narratives. We have that all around us. Artistic intelligence and double agency, this question of being both inside with and without social, inside and outside, I think is crucial for navigating beyond this kind of reactionism. I'm really, for example, I should have concluded a quote here, but I can find my copy. My friend Li Yu's book, Art in a Multipolar World, which some of you will have read, has a really important discussion of how, for her, as a Chinese scholar, curator, who spent half her life now in Germany, it's about not being a fixed entity. In China, I think at the point she says, in China, I'm a liberal. I'm arguing for a certain mode of politics and a certain relationship to the expression and to labor. But in the West, in Europe, I'm a statist. I'm like, get your shit together, build infrastructure, ban things for once. And so like when you move and you shift around, you have to understand that the same words mean different things. And I think like focusing not on the words but the things might be part of the key here. Especially the question of what left and right is, what kind of progress and optimism and liberation looks like in different histories is very completely different. I would advocate for this idea that dark forests, subterranean kind of solidarity and intimacy, what for Merton would call the undercommons, I think, for holding critical spaces, for thinking and building solidarities are more valuable than the kind of standard idea of social democratic transparency, which is not to say don't participate in protests in the public sphere, just don't call it art. That's just like good political participation. But at the same time, I think there are like even formalisms, but like forms of artistic intelligence, which I think, at least in my own life, are only possible not through people who I'm publicly constantly shouting about with, but like through people I form kind of like ongoing alliances and read together with and study with and think with. The state will not provide for you, and anyway, maybe it should be prioritizing infrastructure. Identity is politically contingent, non-sacred, catastrophically weaponized. I think we've seen this already quite significantly. This is not necessarily a push against identity politics as a whole, but I think we have like seen this weaponized, I think, much more dangerously by the far right as an identity politics in of itself, as a kind of ethno-nationalist, trauma-driven kind of license to bombard, for instance, than it has meaningfully produced a kind of organized progress in the wider society. Traverse geo-nationaries, I would encourage, I think we're probably representing a lot of different countries here, but I would encourage everyone to just like, get a bit more global in their histories. Just be around. Sorry, I was cutting into like a Jordan Peterson, like 10 steps. 10 steps. And yeah, again, like, not everything has to be art, I think like part of me feels like kind of a form of social participation and a form of political participation and a form of economic participation. You're going to have to hustle. Is not necessarily always intuitively inherently part of your artistic practice, and being able to disentangle those things might be quite important for this level of survival. And I end with, I think this is actually not a real quote, but it's often misquoted. Of everything under heaven is in chaos, the situation is excellent. Cool, that's everything.
Quite a lot to talk about. That's really good. So I'm going to ask two questions to Gary, just quite quick questions, and then let's take questions. There's going to be a mic that Red is going to walk around with, and we'll just take questions in like clumps of your audience. So start comparing your questions. So my two questions are part of to do with you as a maker, and then also the second question about multiple narratives. So one of the things I'm kind of always impressed by your approach to things is that you're quite prepared to take on the big picture. Right? So this is like everything, or it's like a few bits that are missing. And I think it's quite unusual for my sense of like what contemporary art is usually doing as artists. They're kind of dedicated to very specific things, which is like their thing, what they do for their practice, and somehow through the postmodern narrative of the postmodern story about classic grand narratives, where they look small stories, and you don't do that. You take all of it on. And when I was showing the slide of when I was preparing the slide of your research with all the images of painted film, I was kind of thinking like, oh, this is like a huge range of stuff, right? And I can see that in the presentation. You're not just dealing with like economics or identity politics or what. It's like it can all be in there. So one is what's going on with that? Because I think it's great. I think there's a kind of preparedness to take everything on. the way you construct it isn't as like, I have a story that sort of can fit everything. It's quite patchy, you're kind of just aggregating things, so like just having a look at what's around. But it does seem like you want to position yourself and try and make sense of, just try and get this, try and somehow not quite capture the whole, but something like first approximation to where we are. And it involves many, many different things, which I think is right. So it's partly about whether that's important for you in terms of your artistic subjectivity in making. Secondly, I think a lot of people don't get into that because it can get really paralyzing because it's just too much to take on. So, you know, when you've got lots of criteria going on, it becomes very difficult to make a decision about what to do next. That's clearly not, I mean, as far as I can see, because I see your public production, you can kind of put all these things into something like a, I wouldn't say coherent picture, but like an overall picture. Because I think we can't get coherence at this point. But it doesn't stop you making either. It's kind of like fuel for you. So I was interested in like your interest in making like the bigger picture, and also like how you negotiate this in terms of not quite being an artist, but also like just positioning the, because you have the slide about artist corner, and then you've got this slide of what we do next. You couldn't come to this slide without all the other work that's gone into understanding the position. So I think it's something about how and why the gathering of all of this stuff into a picture that looks, that kind of, as I said, it's first approximation to where we are now, kind of matters for you as a maker and as a writer. Contrasted to, oh, this is all too complicated, I'm going to stick with this very small thing that I know about.
I mean, I think on one hand it's just sense making. It's like a desire to have a feeling for what's going on. As in like a desire to have a feeling for like, I think I know where I am at. You know, which is not a purely scholarly feeling, it's a kind of instinct to like see how the different observations you make about the world fit together and to try and give an account of that. I guess maybe especially through the catastrophe time of the book, which, I mean, on the maker side, it's like a set of ideas at one point I realized can like refract just quite organically into an exhibition, into a piece of writing, into an opera, into like sort of discursive gatherings. And it was more about this particular cloud of articulation, in that case about like model determination and finance and stuff. Of clustering, it's maybe in that sense it's a bit more like a curatorial practice. It's like almost, I wouldn't call myself curious, but like it's about getting the instinct that there's a cluster of ideas that feel like they belong together or have a relationship to each other, and then finding various types of ways to circumscribe that as a dynamic kind of relationship. And otherwise, I'm just very curious as a person. So I just connect. But then the making stuff, I think I've slowly learned to separate, like the two commissions I'm working on at the moment are both very different from each other and totally separate from any of this, right? Like they're just, I feel like I've kind of, I don't know if it's very good for my career, but it's like, it's kind of like, okay, what is a formally interesting artwork? Like, in this case, there's a kind of microdrama production and a game engine simulation. And I'm interested in exploring various ideas native to those spaces.
But this must inform an orientation in what you're doing with this piece.
It does a bit, but in very tangential ways. I mean, like the microdrama thing, I got very interested in this particular narrative form that's emerging in China at the moment, which were like phone-based, like drama viewing.
Oh yeah.
The 30 second to like 2 minute episodes, like 80 episodes, crazy kind of like narrative beats. And yes, that's related both to this kind of question of algorithmic culture and the question of like Chinese overproduction, actually. The fact that microdramas are probably going to appear on everyone's phones in the next year or so is because they're massively pushing out to economically exploit them. And that is an interesting part of like how this medium, just like the original melodrama, which appeared in the late, like kind of emergence of the bourgeoisie in the late kind of industrial revolution to titillate the kind of new masses who could consume. Like, so in this kind of vague, I guess I'm quite adherent to Jensen in some ways, like this move between like thinking about forms as they are happening, as also a product of a particular historical movement, but also just enjoying the sentimental deliciousness of the form, and then making something with that is, it's not going to contain, like, whatever, geopolitics.
But in that case, the thing that you're working with carries a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, in its shape, in its kind of reason for existing. Yeah, I mean, in other words, another way I think my own interests as an artist are, I've learned to kind of segregate them a little bit as like a form of like a certain kind of, you might like concrete poetry, or you might like certain kinds of things that you think are really valuable and beautiful kind of practices, but aren't everything, and they're not the entirety of my identity either. They're just hopefully inventive or interesting or kind of beautiful formal inquiries.
Okay. So my second question, before we come to you guys, is to do with multipolar, which you were kind of speaking about more at the end. So I think it might be worth just quickly rehearsing what the multipolar is, but in a minute after you finish the question. So it's a kind of response to, it's no longer the US that leads economically. It does, but it's also dealing with many other regions. There's a clear slide towards global majority countries in terms of wealth, but also cultural centers as well. Like museums are now being built in the Gulf and China and so on and so forth, and they're in decline in the US and in Europe. So you can understand a multipolar as a way to think about how different power centers are organized but happen simultaneously with what you call the breakup of globalization. So it's not clear for the emerging artists. It seems pretty clear you don't go to New York. It's not clear that you would go to Berlin, London. London's been near for a long time. And then, so I was interested in the relation between multipolar and what you call Orientalism 2.0, because in a way it's quite a provocation to say, like, maybe there is something in a form of Orientalism which is not the old form of Western colonial degradation of the other, but we need to think about the relation to difference in other terms. So partly just if you could review that, but I was also wondering whether, so the multipolar at the moment, I think partly through reuse, also seems like an exciting way to think about some of the breakup of the old model of Western modernity domination, then the breakup of globalization to where we are now. And I was wondering what sort of channels we see opening up, what are the new channels that seem generative for you in multipolar. There's two parts of the question. One is about the, just to go to the Orientalism thing then, because you've gone quite fast and it seems quite important to me. Then also what new institutional capacities or ways of working, or what does it offer you?
You asked initially about the definition of multipolar, broadly speaking, is about like, okay, if we have lived for like maybe 100 years or less of like the US being the undisputed kind of power hegemon of global economic and political order. Arguably before that we also had the British Empire as like maybe the major power center. And then the idea of the multipolar is like, okay, with the decline of the US grip on global hegemony and its kind of ability to set the rules of the game as other powers for lots of other different reasons. It might be like countries that don't have energy dependencies. It might be the kind of emergence of like China as a global economic giant. It might be the ability of like smaller states like Israel or Russia to exert that, or Yemen to exert their kind of like political influence in ways that are very asymmetrical to like other kinds of measure. But anyway, the emergence of this kind of much more patchwork, fragmented set of competing rule sets that different games are being played at the same time, potentially. Yeah, I already thought through the origins into what I think exactly is more about like it was when I was writing a bit about, I was trying to start writing about this kind of a multipolar technoculture thing, which is thinking about the idea of what happens when like global technological narrative in particular, which has been, let's just say, overwhelmingly centered on even California over the last 60 years, slowly moves away, or at least distributes away from purely that place to other parts of the world, notably China, and not just how like, okay, the Chinese will make robots too, but actually China is a place with a very different set of economic interests and supply chains and like export incentives and so on. So the way in which China does technology and does innovation is going to be also very, very different. And then downstream of that, the cultural emergences along places that China's influence touches, for example, will be very different from the way in which like an Apple or a Meta or something does tech. I mean, you can already. I think I first started vaguely thinking about this when I met someone who worked at ByteDance in Dubai and realized that, okay, ByteDance actually does a lot of business and is interested in doing more business, white labeling its technology, its algorithms. Like, it's not about, it sells ByteDance algorithms to other social media platforms in Latin America and like other parts of the world as building blocks to build your own services, which is quite different. Like, Apple would never do that, for instance. Like, Meta, I believe, doesn't do that. I mean, sure, it's got an open AI model right now, but in terms of just a very different approach to like building big tech, even. And so but in this moment, I guess I was trying to think about like, okay, what does the Western subject and the non-Western subject do in relationship to each other? It's like, it's easy when you're the hegemon, it's easy when you're just like, I need to develop. But when you're kind of in this strange cusp, kind of like jostling situation where you're genuinely maybe representing alternative models, but also you can see eye to eye with each other. And, when you asked me, I wondered for a second, like, what were the accounts by the Japanese of the Americans when the black ships first came? When these like two societies would equally consider themselves kind of main characters, let's say, kind of address each other, rather than this version that's always the kind of colonial dynamic, where it's always like the colonial other to be subjugated or something. And what do you do when you actually do know that the West and the East are currently quite different? Like the number of books that are coming out trying to explain contemporary China to a US audience, you constantly encounter this issue where, again, the same words are used for different things. And it's kind of, I would argue for anyone who has good experience experience in China, that it's like always still astonishing how hard it is and how few people are able to legibly and fluently communicate culturally and kind of like effectively, truthfully between those two spaces in terms of the subjective experiences that are true to those two different places. The second part of the question was
what are the opportunities? What are the new channels?
I mean, for me, I think the opportunity is basically trying to understand what a world is. Like trying to make more an articulation of what that version of like subjectivity and society and identity looks like, which I think is like massive questions, but they do underlie, and there's often somewhat unquestioned in the way they underlie everything. On a more kind of practical level, I mean, I think there are very interesting opportunities for still building kind of transnational, like planetary, if you like, kind of alliances and networks, which are not necessarily, I'm personally very invested in trying to do this, of like, you think of somewhere like Dubai, which is in many ways quite a cursed place in terms of its, labor structure, in terms of its the quality of it, the texture of its life worlds. But at the same time, it is also, like London, as a weird kind of center, is kind of one of the kind of capital. Dubai is probably the de facto capital of the global south, because that's where everyone transacts through. And when you are in Dubai, you meet and you build relationships of solidarity, that genuine kind of encounter with so many different kinds of people that you would not be able to meet in New York. And then you realize that, okay, there is a world that we're occupying together, usually along, in my case, in our case, a certain kind of like global discursive artistic kind of community. But the same exists also in like various kind of like actually existing cosmopolitanisms of like labor migration, and of like what can be built up with like the kind of relationship of China to its like global, to its like Southeast Asian neighbors in terms of the kind of inevitable integration of like labor communities in that, for example, or like what will happen, with the Western European migration crisis much harder. But I guess I mean like these new channels, I think mostly through economics, new channels open up. new forms of necessity of like supply chains and like flows of people emerge, and through that, new worlds are built through people encountering each other and discovering the way it's always happened, in a way.
All right, let's see, any questions? Let's see one of it. Let's take a question just in the middle. Come down. That's it, just across here. Because Red has to move the mic around the room, we can take questions in that half of the room first.
Yep.
And then questions in this half.
Thank you so much for your talk, Gary. I have a question to do with the artistic canon of contemporary art and the role of art education in this. Because my background was there, so just bear with me. I did my BA in Slade School of Fine Art, which is a major UK institution that almost to the extent set the convention of art education curriculum. There's one phenomenon that I observed throughout my education is that they, not just the students, but also the member of staff who are practicing artists themselves, they seem to be incredibly willing to engage with the poetics of politics rather than direct engagement with politics itself.
Yeah, well, that's a slave, right?
That's
why you're here now.
Only observing slave, but also in general, it's like almost an ambience to me that's happening around. So I want to see how you interpret this almost a divorce between, I guess, belief and actual doings, and how is that a sign of the educational can break down, or is it because I intuitively I think the staff members that I talk to, they hold and they are defensive of a certain kind of liberal values. They believe there is a set of liberal values embedded in the ontology of contemporary art practice. But I do not believe in that, and I think it's the opposite.
So just to, because we don't have a lot of time. So just I don't want to personalize it to those people. So can we just turn the question to something about aesthetics, the role? Because when you say poetics,
yeah, they love
so,
the aesthetic of politics, but they refuse to engage with politics per se. So I want your interpretation of this phenomenon.
I think someone else might actually have a much better grasp on this kind of history. My interpretation of this in the long majority has always been like a little bit the fault of the New Left, and the kind of like shifting in after the post-68 period of like essentially turning culture into the terrain of politics rather than politics proper as the terrain of politics. And this, is brought us cultural studies, brought us a lot of different forms of critique, and was very compelling and effective for a long time. But there was a kind of like I feel like a kind of extrapolated afterglow of that particular movement, counterculture, let's say. That's my kind of more macro interpretation. And in the micro lens, I mean, for as long as I've been an adult in this country, there hasn't really been an effective politics, right? I feel like the kind of, like across the West, a degree of hope in like political mechanisms as they are presented to us as effecting political change has been so kind of like diminished and impoverished that like what we have is a kind of re-performance of the idea of what politics might feel like if we were actually to do it. And there's a great book called If We Burn, and some of you might read it, which is about like mass mobilizations across the global south actually in the last 10-15 years, and the way in which like this also like the modes of organization that were required to turn into political like priority and political kind of changes were not quite like effective. But yeah, no, sorry, actually the answer that's more global south. Like in the UK context, I think there is a kind of middle period, and others who are of this generation might be able to speak to it a bit better, where I feel like you still had a sort of a declining but still optimistic idea of the welfare state, which could provide for a certain kind of like a certain idea of a good life and a certain idea of where art could, the role of art and culture played in political change. But that's slowly shrunken to the point where it barely exists for us anymore. But some people have still built their practices on it, so it's hard to shift that.
Okay, any more questions like over here? Otherwise, we're ready to move the mic like over there. I think it might be easy to just go up and send it across. So there's one question here, and there was somebody else. There's a question.
Yeah, on the far.
Yeah, so just go to the middle. And then after that question, if you guys could just move the mic. And if you could come down a little bit, so we can get the mic to you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering about in today's narrative, how important is history to play part, not as a precondition or the cultural background, but as its cyclical nature and repetition, as we always say in the past, that history always repeats itself. And with this very new material base that we have right now, does the nostalgic and historic storytelling still make sense? Thank you.
Yeah, really interesting question. I mean, I don't know where it's done the history repeating itself thing. I mean, I guess we like to recognize patterns and stuff. They'll do historical excavations, archival excavations that say also one of the key, instincts of contemporary art, like still makes sense. I would say broadly, yes. I mean, I guess also I do it myself a little bit. I do think there are challenges. I mean, I think to make it more concrete, for example, the glorification of the Banda movement, this kind of first symbolic kind of a gathering of like non-aligned nations, basically, before the non-aligned movement. I think we often take all the Macy conferences, if you're on the technocratic side, like we often take these kind of historical, iconic moments as something to kind of hark back to and hope for, and that if only we could repeat this particularly amazing moment of synthesis. And you actually go back into the weeds of that history, and like everyone they were like fighting all over each other, and it wasn't like some kind of easy kind. I think we tend to smooth over the better examples, or the better kind of moments. So I think there is a bit of a danger there of like, I feel like in Barcelona right now there's a re-exhibition of the CyberSyn set. You know the Chilean cybernetic experiment, where they always exhibit the seats because they look very Star Trek, and it's always a bit concerning to me. It's like, I mean, I don't even know how far they got in terms of implementation before Allende was killed, and so we're always exhibiting this kind of slightly fantasized version of if only socialism plus technology had won, and the coup had never happened, rather than necessarily building what would be the new version of that, having pretended that it might have been realized. So yeah, I think there are lots of allusions to this, and of course the romanticization of history is incredibly dangerous. And we see it all the time now. I mean, personally, I think it's also a fascinating aspect of identity. The Germans reaching for a pre-war kind of imaginary, the Uzbeks reaching for a pre-Russian imaginary, where you're going for Timur or Genghis Khan even at some times, which is an incredible anti-colonial predecessor to go for. So yeah, I think it's that all these moves and instincts are happening all the time, and no blurry answer, but I think it's definitely important to look at history, but it's also nice to be clear-eyed about it.
Okay, there's a question over.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is very open-ended.
Can you just move the mic closer?
My question is very open-ended. It's following the line of what should come next. Do you believe there should be a balance in speculation without relying on fiction?
A balance.
Yeah,
balance in speculation.
Finding still a material base for speculation without becoming full fiction.
So can you just open up the question a little bit so we can understand what's motivating the question?
Discourse, seeking discourse that still is grounded from real instead of becoming just for fantasy.
Is this for you a kind of, you're saying that you're kind of critiquing the kind of like the generalization of fantasy, or you want more fantasy? Yeah.
No, if it's fantasy, I don't want to get to fantasy or fiction. Speculate among real.
Yeah, I mean, in my own work, I'm with you. I'm hideously unimaginative, and I think reality is weird enough as it is. That like, I mean, I think for me, it's like about like how that which we call the real is so incredibly like multiplicitous and unstable, and that's where I think a lot of my own work comes from. But of course, there's a space for incredible speculative worlding as well. I guess whether we call what we think has teeth, what we think has what is interesting, what we claim as having a certain kind of political or aesthetic agency or impact is a bit more case by case. There has been maybe a slightly inflationary or deflationary kind of effect on the idea of speculation as a kind of tool, imagining otherwise as a mode.
At the same time, it's happening all the time through social media and so on.
Yeah.
So, I mean, very clearly, Make America Great Again, it's an entirely speculative, hypothetical project, but it's the reality of American politics as well. So, it's kind of that separation between the speculative or the fictional or the fantastical and material conditions has, the thing as Gary was saying, that art stuff has migrated into the political real, and that dominates the political real, certainly in the Western space, I imagine elsewhere. So the Gulf seems to me like a version of somewhere built through a fantasy of modernity, but it's also like the reality of the Gulf being that dominant actor in AI and sort of economic development and so on and so forth. So multipolarity seems to kind of involve this duality.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking momentarily of yesterday there was a meeting between the sheikhs of Abu Dhabi and Dubai or Sharjah with Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI. It was a very awkward picture of two very finely dressed sheikhs and like Sam Altman in his little t-shirt looking kind of awkward. And yeah, I mean, maybe a missing word culturally from a lot of this discussion, oddly, and also, as in my talk, oddly, and also from your talk, is the last 20 years of tech, right? The idea of speculation and hyperstition and the relationship of finance to self-fulfilling prophecy, and now the relationship of tech to traditional national sovereignties, for instance, is very much treading in both these spaces, like hyper speculative, but also quite actively building and buying up pieces of countries and making deals at the level of states, and then whether you collapse those big things down into the speculative or you bring the speculative up into the real is kind of up to you. Side of the bed you want to sit on.
Okay, see, there's one last question right at the front here. Can you just come down to the mic? Just over here. This will be the last question, and then Gary's going to come for a drink with us at the bar, so you can ask him there for a moment.
Okay, just following a little bit what has been said in terms of you were articulating how the right is like a very specific vision of the future, and the left is sort of lacking that. And to what extent do you think that art should have a future vision in it, or futurity, as well as like saying reality itself, so the presence has so many layers, and it's like more interesting than fiction, it makes no sense. To what extent should art draft futurity?
This is an entirely subjective response. I can't speak for I think other people's practices, but I think if on that kind of classic right and left, the right always has a better vision of the future, the left is always in like disarray kind of thing. I think art needs to play the role of complexifying contemporary desire. Like of the right is always able to go in this pastiche that we're drawing. The right is always able to kind of capture the kind of most like atavistic and kind of almost lowest hanging but ripest fruits of like how, you know, the currents of resentment and desire, and also just actual positive desire as well, is happening in different kind of cultural kind of moments. And I would hope that art should not like, it just never gets very interesting when you're just like painting a version of the more latest version of the good life, which is kind of just like everyone living comfortably and having like enough clean water, and like, you know, these are not like deep alterity things. These are things that, but rather having articulation of like, you know, what drives the kind of modes of desire that are kind of like sort of the palette in our current kind of historical landscape, and how can we kind of build out those into not even more progressive, just like weirder spaces, maybe like less tediously kind of like just steak and butter and pills and immortality ones, for instance, and like what is opening up the space of imagination, basically, to allow people to imagine more than those kind of deeply reactionary worlds.
Yeah, and I think there's that part of it. But I think what the talk does really well is give some really concrete history and a sense of the categories that we're working in. So when we talk about art, it tends to just become like a flat term that everyone's doing art, but actually we're very specifically located in terms of what the art world is and how we're organized and mediated through something called an art world in relation to this kind of shifting dynamic and globalization and multipolarity and so on. And I was really grateful to you for bringing that in with some quite specific concrete detail, not just like within the art system, but actually the forms of mediation and communication that are happening elsewhere have a huge impact on what we think we're up to and our difference from other things. But also, as you say here, there's still things that we do in art, which we still do in art that other places don't do, and those can be mobilized. So I think there's a when I was setting up the introduction, those are very broad categories, and it's just a bit like hand waving. And I think your presentation was really great for giving us some concrete detail of what the last 10, 15 years have meant in terms of where we are right now. So thank you, Gary. Thanks. Thank you. So as I said, there's drinks now, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next talk. Thanks a lot. Yes.